August 17th, 1424. A sun-baked field in Normandy. The Duke of Bedford, Henry V's brother, stares across the battlefield at the largest army he's ever faced. 9,000 enemy soldiers, French knights and Scottish warriors, united by one shared purpose: to drive the English from France forever. Bedford has just 6,000 men. The odds are hopeless. His enemies include the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, and 4,000 Scottish veterans who've been fighting the English for years. They know English tactics, they've studied English weaknesses, and they've come to Verneuil to settle old scores. If Bedford loses this battle, England's empire in France dies with him. The infant King Henry VI will lose everything his father conquered. The greatest military achievement in English history, the dual monarchy of England and France, will crumble in a single afternoon. But Bedford has one advantage his enemies don't expect. One tactical innovation that could change everything. The question is, will it be enough? This is the Battle of Verneuil. Welcome to Britain's history. Today we're diving into one of the most decisive yet overlooked victories of the 100 Years' War. A battle where English tactical supremacy crushed a Franco-Scottish alliance and proved that Agincourt was no fluke. Because Verneuil wasn't just about longbows and men-at-arms. It was about alliance warfare, about the Scottish intervention in France, and about how one brilliant commander held together an empire that stretched from Calais to the Loire. But before we get to those volleys of arrows darkening the Norman sky, before we watch the Scottish schiltrons break under English steel, we need to understand how this battle came to be fought. Because without knowing the political crisis that brought 4,000 Scots to fight in France, without understanding the delicate balance of power that made this battle essential, you can't appreciate what Bedford achieved on that August afternoon. And if you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval warfare, make sure you're subscribed. We cover the battles that built Britain, from Norman conquests to Plantagenet triumphs, from the struggles that forged a kingdom to the victories that built an empire. Don't miss them. Let's go back to 1422, when Henry V died at the height of his power, leaving a 9-month-old son to inherit the crowns of both England and France. Henry V had been perhaps the greatest warrior king in English history, victorious at Agincourt, conqueror of Normandy, acknowledged heir to the French throne by the Treaty of Troyes. His death changed everything. The infant Henry VI couldn't rule. England needed a regent, and that regent was John, Duke of Bedford, Henry V's younger brother. Bedford was everything a medieval war leader needed to be: an experienced soldier, a capable diplomat, a man who understood both warfare and politics. But he faced an impossible task: holding together Henry V's conquests with a child king and enemies who smelled weakness. The French had never accepted English rule. The Dauphin Charles, later Charles VII, controlled most of southern France and claimed the throne despite the Treaty of Troyes. He had capable generals, growing popular support, and most dangerously he had allies. Scottish armies had fought in France before. The old alliance between Scotland and France dated back centuries, born of shared hatred for English expansion. In 1419, Scottish forces under the Earl of Buchan had arrived in France. They weren't mercenaries, they were allies come to drive the English from French soil and settle old scores from the Scottish Wars of Independence. By 1424, there were thousands of Scottish soldiers in French service, experienced fighters who'd proved themselves against English armies before. The Scots brought something the French lacked: discipline forged in generations of warfare against English armies. French armies were magnificent, brave, well-equipped, filled with knights whose personal courage was legendary. Their heavy cavalry was the finest in Europe, their individual warriors renowned for prowess in tournament and battle. But French tactics were outdated, trapped in an aristocratic military culture that prized individual glory over collective effectiveness. They still believed in the devastating cavalry charge, the individual prowess of heavily armoured knights thundering across battlefields on massive destriers. Agincourt should have taught them better. It didn't. French military culture couldn't adapt because adaptation required admitting that peasant archers were superior to noble knights. This wasn't just tactical conservatism. It was social revolution disguised as military reform. For French nobles, accepting English methods meant accepting that birth and breeding mattered less than professional competence, that centuries of chivalric tradition had been rendered obsolete by Welsh longbowmen. Scottish armies were different. Scotland had fought the English for decades and learned hard lessons about English archery and defensive tactics through bitter experience. Every Scottish military leader had faced English longbows, seen what they could do to cavalry charges, watched noble knights die under peasant arrows. Scottish schiltrons, dense formations of spearmen with 18-foot pikes, had held their own against English cavalry at Stirling Bridge and Bannockburn. More importantly, the Scots understood combined arms warfare, infantry, cavalry, and coordination working together in disciplined formations. Scottish military doctrine emphasised flexibility and adaptation. Where French armies remained locked in feudal structures, Scottish forces had developed professional competence born of necessity. They couldn't afford tactical obsolescence. England was too close, English armies too dangerous. Scottish survival depended on military effectiveness, not chivalric tradition. By 1424, the Franco-Scottish alliance was achieving real success. They'd won victories against English garrisons, recaptured towns, pushed the English back toward the Channel ports. The momentum was shifting. If this continued, Henry V's conquests would crumble, the dual monarchy would collapse, and England would lose everything it had gained in decades of warfare. Bedford had to act. He couldn't afford a defensive strategy. That would only delay defeat. He needed a decisive battle, a victory so complete it would break the Franco-Scottish alliance and restore English prestige. The opportunity came when French and Scottish forces concentrated near Verneuil, a strategic town controlling the approaches to Normandy. The Franco-Scottish army was formidable. Contemporary sources put their strength at around 9,000 men. 4,000 were Scots under the Earl of Buchan and the Earl of Douglas, experienced soldiers who'd campaigned in France for years. The French contingent included the cream of their nobility, the Duke of Alençon, the Count of Aumerle, dozens of knights and men-at-arms who represented the military elite of France. Bedford's army was smaller but perfectly designed for medieval warfare. 6,000 men, but structured according to the tactical lessons learned from decades of fighting in France. This wasn't a feudal host summoned for 40 days' service. This was a professional army, experienced in European warfare, disciplined in English methods. The corps was English, longbowmen from the Welsh marches who'd grown up with warbows, men whose lives depended on accurate shooting under pressure. These weren't part-time soldiers. Archery was their profession, their skill honed through years of campaign and battle. English men-at-arms came from the nobility and gentry, knights and esquires who'd served in France, understood continental warfare, knew how to fight dismounted in coordinated formations. Bedford's force included Norman levies, who'd accepted English rule and fought to defend their territories, English garrison troops from captured towns throughout Normandy, and veteran soldiers who'd served in France for years. This was almost entirely an English and Anglo-Norman army, a testament to Bedford's ability to maintain loyalty among conquered populations through effective leadership. Notably absent were Burgundian allies. The Duke of Burgundy had withdrawn his forces just before the battle to deal with problems in his own territories, leaving Bedford without crucial cavalry support. This abandonment made Bedford's situation even more desperate. He'd have to win with what he had, not what he'd been promised. The tactical integration was sophisticated despite these limitations. English longbowmen provided ranged firepower. English men-at-arms formed the defensive core. Norman cavalry, what little Bedford had, remained mobile for pursuit and exploitation. Bedford had created an instrument of war precisely calibrated for medieval battlefields, every element designed to support the others despite numerical disadvantage. English tactical doctrine by 1424 was sophisticated. They'd learned from Crécy, Poitiers and Agincourt that defensive positions, combined arms and disciplined archery could defeat larger armies. Bedford positioned his forces carefully. Men-at-arms dismounted in the centre, longbowmen on the flanks protected by stakes, cavalry held in reserve for the decisive moment. The battle began at dawn on August 17, 1424. The Franco-Scottish army advanced across open ground toward the English line. It should have been a lesson from Agincourt. Don't attack English defensive positions across open ground under archery fire. But medieval military culture prized courage above tactics, and the flower of French chivalry wouldn't be deterred by peasant archers. The Scottish contingent was more cautious. They'd fought the English before and knew what longbows could do. But they were committed to the attack, allied with the French. Honour demanded they advance. Tactical wisdom suggested they hold back. Medieval warfare often came down to this tension between military logic and social expectations. When the Allied army came within range, English longbows opened fire. Contemporary chroniclers described the sound as thunderous, the sky darkening with arrows shot in coordinated volleys. This wasn't Hollywood archery. This was industrial killing perfected through decades of warfare. English archers could loose 12 aimed arrows per minute, and Bedford had positioned them for maximum effect along the flanks where they could enfilade advancing formations. Thousands of arrows per minute slammed into the advancing ranks, creating a killing zone that turned organised advance into chaos. The arrows themselves were instruments of precision death. English war arrows weren't hunting shafts, they were armour-piercing bodkins designed specifically for European warfare. 3 feet long, with steel points forged to penetrate mail and plate, they could kill a horse at 200 yards, bring down a knight at 100. When loosed in coordinated volleys by experienced archers, they created firepower density that no medieval army could sustain. Bedford had learned tactical lessons from every English victory in France. He positioned stakes to break cavalry charges, created overlapping fields of fire, held reserves for the decisive moment. His archers weren't just shooting, they were executing a tactical plan designed to channel enemy movement, disrupt formation integrity, create opportunities for decisive intervention by English men-at-arms. The French assault was more sophisticated than another Agincourt-style cavalry charge. The French and Scottish commanders had learned from previous defeats. They wouldn't repeat the mistakes that cost them at Crécy and Agincourt. Most French knights and Scottish warriors dismounted to fight on foot, understanding that cavalry charges into prepared English positions were suicide. The main Franco-Scottish assault came as disciplined infantry formations, dismounted knights in full plate armour, advancing with poleaxes and swords, Scottish schiltrons bristling with 18-foot pikes. This was medieval combined arms warfare. Heavy infantry to break English lines, supported by limited cavalry on the flanks targeting English baggage and supplies rather than the prepared defensive positions. Only Italian mercenary cavalry, Lombard professionals fighting for French gold, remained mounted, tasked with flanking movements around the English position. Their mission wasn't to break English lines, but to strike the baggage train, create chaos, and exploit any gaps that might develop during the main assault. This tactical evolution made the Franco-Scottish army more dangerous than simple cavalry charges. Dismounted knights were harder to stop with archery, more disciplined in advance, better able to exploit gaps in English formations. Bedford faced enemies who'd studied English methods and developed counter-tactics specifically designed to neutralise longbow advantages. The Scottish schiltrons held together longer. Dense formations of spearmen, shields locked, advancing steadily despite casualties. These were veteran soldiers who'd faced English archery before and knew that survival depended on maintaining formation. If they could reach the English line intact, those long spears would make short work of dismounted men-at-arms. But Bedford had learned from previous battles. English archers didn't just shoot and wait for the enemy to reach them. When the Scottish formations were disrupted by archery, when gaps appeared in the schiltrons, Bedford ordered his men-at-arms forward. This was combined arms warfare at its medieval best. Archery to disrupt, infantry to exploit, cavalry to pursue. The Scottish resistance was fierce, but the battle's most crucial moment came from an unexpected quarter. The Italian mercenary cavalry had successfully flanked the English position and struck the baggage train behind Bedford's lines. They captured horses, supplies and camp followers, a significant tactical success that could have changed everything. But medieval warfare was full of such opportunities, lost to greed and indiscipline. The Lombard cavalry, thinking the battle won, began looting the English baggage instead of pressing their advantage. They had Bedford's army caught between hammer and anvil, French and Scottish infantry pressing from the front, Italian cavalry attacking from behind. Victory was within reach. Instead, the Italians loaded themselves with plunder and fled the battlefield, abandoning their French allies in the critical moment. If they had returned to attack the English rear while the main assault continued, Bedford's position would have become untenable. One commander's failure to exploit success handed Bedford the margin he needed for victory. The Earl of Douglas, one of the great Scottish nobles, fought desperately as this opportunity slipped away. The Earl of Buchan, commander of the Scottish contingent, died leading a final charge against English positions that might have succeeded with Italian cavalry support. These weren't cowards running from battle. These were experienced warriors dying because medieval coalition warfare depended on coordination that mercenaries couldn't provide. When the Scottish line finally broke, the slaughter was tremendous. Chronicles describe hundreds of Scottish nobles dead on the field, thousands of common soldiers killed in the pursuit. This wasn't just a military defeat. This was the annihilation of Scottish military power in France. The survivors fled toward the Loire, but Scottish intervention in the 100 Years' War was finished. The French contingent fared no better. The Duke of Alençon was captured, ransomed for a fortune that bankrupted his duchy. The Count of Aumale died fighting. Dozens of French nobles joined him. Men whose deaths represented not just individual tragedies, but the collapse of French confidence in cavalry charges and individual prowess. English losses were minimal. Contemporary sources suggest fewer than 200 English dead, though medieval casualty figures are always suspect. What matters isn't the exact number, it's the ratio. Bedford had achieved what every medieval commander dreamed of: decisive victory, with minimal losses, enemy armies destroyed, political objectives secured through military success. Verneuil's immediate consequences were dramatic and far-reaching. The Franco-Scottish alliance was broken. Scotland couldn't afford to send more armies to France after losing so many experienced soldiers and nobles in a single afternoon. The dead included not just individual warriors, but the institutional knowledge of Scottish military leadership. The experienced commanders who understood European warfare and could coordinate with French allies. French resistance continued, but without Scottish discipline and tactical expertise, French armies reverted to outdated methods that English commanders knew how to defeat. The Scottish contingent had provided intellectual capital as much as military manpower, strategic thinking, tactical innovation, professional competence. Their annihilation at Verneuil removed French access to military leaders who understood how to fight the English effectively. The political ramifications extended throughout Europe. Verneuil demonstrated that English tactical methods could achieve decisive victory against coalition warfare. That numerical superiority meant nothing against disciplined professional armies. European observers noted the battle's tactical lessons, began adapting their own military practices to counter English advantages, started developing the combined arms methods that would eventually neutralise longbow supremacy. Bedford used his victory brilliantly. He didn't just celebrate, he advanced. English armies recaptured territory, restored friendly garrisons, reminded French nobles that resistance carried deadly costs. For 3 decades after Verneuil, English control of northern France seemed secure. Bedford had bought time, space, and credibility for the infant Henry VI's dual monarchy. But Verneuil also revealed the fundamental problem with English strategy in France. English armies could win battles. They'd proved that repeatedly. But battles don't win wars unless they achieve lasting political change. The French didn't accept English rule because they lost at Verneuil. They adapted, learned, found new tactics and new leaders. Scottish intervention in France didn't end permanently. Later in the century, Scottish soldiers would return to fight against the English, but they never again fielded the kind of experienced, disciplined army that fought at Verneuil. The battle had killed a generation of Scottish military leaders and shown the limits of traditional alliance warfare against English tactical supremacy. For Bedford personally, Verneuil was the achievement that defined his career. He'd faced his greatest challenge, a coalition of experienced enemies with numerical superiority, and won a complete victory. He'd proved that English tactical methods could still dominate European battlefields, that the lessons of Agincourt weren't flukes, but principles that careful commanders could apply repeatedly. The tactical lessons of Verneuil influenced military thinking for generations. Combined arms warfare, coordinated use of archery, infantry, and cavalry became the standard for successful medieval armies. The battle proved that discipline and coordination could overcome individual courage and numerical superiority, lessons that English commanders would remember for centuries. Verneuil also marked the end of an era. Medieval warfare was changing. Gunpowder weapons were becoming more effective. Professional armies were replacing feudal levies. The social structures that made English longbow tactics possible were evolving. Verneuil was one of the last great victories of traditional English military methods. Within a generation, Joan of Arc would inspire French resistance that English armies couldn't crush. Artillery would make defensive positions less secure. Professional armies would develop counter-tactics for archery. The world that produced Verneuil was disappearing, but the battle remained a masterpiece of medieval warfare. What makes Verneuil matter isn't just the tactical brilliance or the decisive victory, it's what the battle represented. Proof that English military methods could still dominate European warfare when properly applied. That alliance warfare wasn't automatically superior to careful tactical planning. That one afternoon's fighting could secure decades of strategic advantage. Bedford returned to England briefly after Verneuil, received honours fitting his achievement, then went back to France to continue the war. He died in 1435, having spent his life holding together his brother's conquests. The dual monarchy he'd protected lasted another 20 years, but without Bedford's military genius, English power in France gradually crumbled. The Scottish nobles who died at Verneuil were mourned in castles from the Highlands to the borders. Their deaths represented more than individual tragedies. They marked the end of Scotland's ability to challenge English power through continental alliances. For a generation, Scottish military attention turned inward, to clan conflicts and border raids, rather than grand strategic intervention. French chronicles of Verneuil reveal medieval attitudes towards military defeat. French writers attributed the defeat to bad luck and poor coordination, anything except English tactical superiority. Medieval military culture found it difficult to admit that enemy methods were simply better. English chronicles celebrated Verneuil as divine vindication of English claims. For English chroniclers, Verneuil confirmed that God approved of English rule in France, that Henry V's conquests had heavenly sanction. Modern historians see Verneuil as tactical evolution and professional competence. Bedford won because he understood combined arms warfare better than his opponents, not through divine favour. The battlefield at Verneuil is quiet farmland now. There's no monument to the Scottish nobles who died there, no marker for the French knights who fell. The field where 9,000 men fought is remembered mainly by historians studying medieval warfare. But walk that field on an August afternoon and you can imagine the thunder of advancing infantry, the whistle of arrows, the clash of steel. You can picture Bedford watching as English tactics shattered another enemy coalition. You can understand why chroniclers called it the Second Agincourt, not because it was identical, but because it proved that Agincourt's lessons could be applied by commanders who understood their trade. If this is the kind of history that fascinates you, the battles where tactical brilliance overcame impossible odds, where alliance warfare met English discipline and lost, where one afternoon's fighting changed the balance of power for decades, then you know what to do. This channel exists because these stories deserve to be told. Thank you for watching Britain's history. The stories that mattered told the way they deserved.